Alright, what's up, guys? New tier list today. Actually, this is one I probably should have brought you a long time ago. This deck I actually have a ton of experience with. This is the last regional that I went to. I actually topped with this deck of all decks. Uh, yeah, it's a fairly fun deck. Yeah, I haven't gone to a regional over a year. I think we all know why. But this deck is an exciting deck. It's a going second deck. If you have any suggestions for any decks, leave it in the comment section below. I'm gonna be doing a ton of decks over the next few weeks just because I've been playing so many different decks, getting so much experience with a ton of different decks, putting many hours into it. So just let me know what other decks you want to see, and I'll try to handle it as soon as possible. But let's get started. First of all, we're doing like I said, Tenyis. Tenyis are a deck based around non-effect monsters. I'll be honest with you, there probably aren't going to be any F tiers in this one because, to be honest with you, this is a really recent archetype that there aren't a lot of really bad cards in this deck. Just because it's really recent. But at the same time, there aren't a lot of broken cards in this deck. Otherwise, it would be topping as much as Dragon Links. But let's get started. First, we've got the non-effect monster. This is I'd say right there. This is the monk. Basically, what he does is nothing. He's just basically a means to an end. Basically, all he requires is a Tenyi monster to summon. You summon him using any of your free special summon Tenyi monsters, and that's about it. That's all he does. But the whole deck revolves around non-effect monsters, and this entire archetype has two non-effect monsters, despite the fact that the entire deck revolves around two non-effect monsters. Uh, so basically, yeah, you just keep him on the field, and then you can do all types of cool stuff with him. When he's on the field, you can activate the additional effects of all of the other Tenyis. So for that reason, he's really good. You need him. You have to play him, and not only do you have to play him, you have to play three of him. But at the same time, he's like, I wish his stats were a little bit better, maybe. He is a Link 1, which is cool, but I'd love him to be like maybe, 1,500, maybe 2,000. I wish he had better stats, but he definitely comes in clutch. I can even put him in A tier, honestly. You do 100% need him. This is Draco. He's one I actually don't go into as much as I probably should. Basically, what this card does is it can be destroyed by battle by an effect monster, which is interesting protection because if your opponent, like that'll catch a lot of opponents off guard. Like they'll just attack into it because it's only 2,300, thinking like, okay, that's good, and then they kind of like lose a battle phase because they realize this can't be destroyed by effect monsters. It has an additional effect too, which is if it's the only effect monster on your side of the field, you can destroy cards non-targeting uh, up to the amount of, or destroy monsters non-targeting up to the amount of non-effect monsters on your side of the field and in the graveyard. But again, you have to have this. This basically has to be the only effect monster on the field on your side of the field, which that effect is a little bit. That effect, I'll be honest with you, is a little bit rough because most of the time you'll have other effect monsters on the field before you go into this. So that's my only real problem with this. Shaman is definitely S tier. She's extremely good. Basically, what Shaman does is it lets you discard a card, target any worm in the graveyard, and special summon it back. You can even summon things like Mare, and Mare is such a disgusting card. It would absolutely be banned if more decks had access to it. But basically, you can target any worm, special summon that worm. Very good for just recycling. And the discard cost in this deck is actually not that big of a deal, because all of your monsters have graveyard effects anyway. And the cool thing is if you have like a Tenyi in the graveyard, you can actually discard Mare and then target that same Mare and then special summon it to the field. So awesome effect. The only restriction is that it locks you into non-Tenyi. It locks you into only Tenyi monster effects from the extra deck. You can still activate non-Tenyi monsters from your main deck, like regular effect monsters, but not. You can only activate Tenyi effects from the extra deck. That's the only restriction. Secondly, it has an effect where if a non-effect monster attacks, you can target a card your opponent controls and destroy it, which is pretty cool. It's like it helps you break boards. So this card is very good going first, very good going second. It's one of the very best cards in the deck. This is Berserker. I'd say he's somewhere around like C tier. I don't actually go into him all that much. He's your strongest non-effect monster, but sometimes it's actually just better to go into the effect monsters. And especially with the Link 4, you really don't need to use him quite as much as you once did. But basically what he does is nothing again. He's just a Link 3 effect monster. The only thing is he requires a Link monster to summon. He's basically your biggest. He's the access to the biggest Link monster you could possibly summon. That's basically what he does. And you can basically there's a certain way to play this deck which I personally don't like. But you can play kind of like a protect the castle version of the deck where you summon him, and then you have like the field spell, the counter trap, and you basically just sit on him and a few different cards, and just basically a bunch of hand traps in your hand. And you just protect him, and that's one way to play the deck. But I honestly prefer to go a more going second version of the deck. But that's just me. Like I said, he's okay. Um, this is the Link 4, some Hasara. He's A tier. The only drawback to him, honestly, is the fact that he's a Link 4. It's actually quite a bit of resources. That like one Mare will basically complete the resources, but again, it's actually not this. It's not small. Like it's a decent amount of resources. He's better in the pure version than in going second version, obviously, because the going second version aims to just instantly kind of OTK your opponent. And this is more of like something you set up on turn one. Basically, what this card does is your opponent cannot target effect monsters on your side of the field for attacks. So that effect is just okay. All of its effects basically all help each other. They're all a bunch of okay effects that help each other. Then on top of that, your opponent can't target effect monsters for card effects. That effect is really good because they can't even target their own effect monsters. So if they have like an equip spell, they can't activate it. If they have a card that has to target one of their monsters on their side of the field, they can't activate it. They can't target any of your monsters on your side of the field. No removal, no nothing like that. They can only target non-effect monsters, which that effect is really good because the next effect is really what synergizes the whole card together, which is you can target a monster your opponent controls and then make basically a Tenyi token clone of that monster. So let's say your opponent summons a monster that's 1900 attack, you can make a clone of that monster on your side of the field. It'll become a normal token monster, and it basically fulfills the requirement of having that sort of non-effect monster. And that kind of feeds all of the effects that I've shown above. Now your opponent can only attack that thing, and on top of that, your opponent can only target that thing. And all of the Tenyis have effects that help with the tokens, which is all fairly good. Next is Berserker. This card is a synchro monster. I'd say he's probably B tier. He's actually a pretty good card. I don't honestly go into him as much as I probably should in a Tenyi deck, just because it's a synchro monster. It would have been easier if he was just a Link monster, like a Link 3, for example. But basically, there's only one tuner in the entire deck, and if you don't have access to that tuner, you don't have access to this card. And for those reasons, the card is like iffy to me. Like I said, I'd rather this have just been a Link 3. It's also generic, so you can use it in other decks, which is fine too. But its effects are pretty cool. Basically, what it does is if your opponent activates a monster effect, you can banish that monster. So it doesn't negate, but it banishes that monster. So that definitely can come up in certain situations to be actually better than negating the monster. It's kind of like Doom King in a certain way. It just banishes the monster. On top of that, it has a second effect. And that effect, by the way, doesn't target. So that's a decent out to Dragoon because if they activate to negate, you could just chain this, banish. Secondly, this has an effect where if it destroys an opponent's effect monster by battle, it gains that attack, and then on top of that, it can attack a second time in a row. That effect is also very good for breaking boards, going second. Definitely more of a going second card, which I like, which is the way I prefer to play this deck. Next is Veshuda. Veshuda, I'd say, is... Why is the mouse not working? Okay. Veshuda is, I'd say, S tier. He's like the main board breaker. Like, you need Veshuda to break boards. Basically, what this card does is all Tenyis, and I should have explained this right, if you control no effect monsters, basically, if you can have an empty field or all of your monsters have no effects, you can special summon this monster from your hand for free. Secondly, all Tenyis have an effect where if you control a non-effect monster, they gain an additional, like, different cool effect. So basically, this card, if you control a non-effect monster, you can target a card your opponent controls and bounce it back to their hand absolutely for free. That effect is really, really good. It's very good for breaking boards. It's very good in the grind game. This is your main way of this is your main form of spot removal in the deck. It's an extremely good card. Also, the stats on this card are fantastic. Level 7, 2500 defense. Sometimes it's, you don't have the best hand. It's tough to get rid of this thing. 2500 defense is a lot. On top of that, you have all of your other interruptions. It's a fairly good card. Definitely up there in this deck. Definitely one of the better cards. Shathana. This card I'd say is A tier. This card is, again, a fairly good card. Basically, if an effect monster is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon that effect monster. I'm sorry. If a non-effect monster is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon that non-effect monster back, and then you can destroy a monster your opponent controls non-targeting and inflict 1000. All fairly good effects, so it's fairly good with the monk. Your opponent destroys the monk, and it doesn't have to be particularly the monk. It can actually just be any normal monster, so it's actually good in, like, other splashable and other normal monster decks. So if your normal monster gets destroyed, you special summon it back, destroy your opponent's monster, any monster your opponent controls non-targeting, and then inflict 1000. And it's actually pretty good for crashing too, because you can, like, crash a monk and then bring the monk back, destroy a monster, and then attack with the monk again, because it's basically like a new monster. So that effect is pretty good. Definitely one of the better, like, battle phase ones. Maputra, this is actually one of my least favorite ones. I almost never use it. It almost never comes up. Basically, what it does is if one of your non-effect monsters is targeted, you can negate and destroy. So, again, like, there just aren't a lot of cards that target non-effect monsters. Like, for the most part, like, a lot of the targeting cards in Yu-Gi-Oh are like impermanence, stuff like that, effect veiler. Like, most of the targeting cards in the meta right now basically just negate monster effects, but your non-effect monsters have no effects. So this one just comes up the least. Like, I've activated this card so few times. Again, unless you're playing, like, Protect the Castle with Berserker, this card just doesn't come up quite as often as it should. Next, Ashana. This card, or Asana, this card is definitely S tier. It's definitely a very good card. Basically, if you control a non-effect monster, you can special summon a Tenyi monster from your deck, and then you're locked into worm special summons for the rest of the turn. Which means you can summon as many non-worms all you want for the entire duration of the turn. Also, you can still normal summon. This deck is fortunate enough to not have any natural normal summons. So you can play stuff like Vanity's Fiend, for example. You can activate this effect and then summon any worm you want, tribute that, summon a Vanity's Fiend. This deck has absolutely no normal summons. It's all special summons. So you can play some of the best normal summons in the game. You can play stuff like Vanity's Ruler. You can play stuff like Phantom Sky Blaster. You can play stuff like the Witch, the Forbidden Witch. I forget her name, but you can play stuff like her to search things like Forbidden Droplets, for example. And yeah, it's just, this deck has no normal summons, so you can play any cool normal summon that you like. And also the tribute summoning normal summons, which is pretty cool. So yeah, this one's actually pretty good. Nahata, I'd say, is somewhere on C tier. It's similar to Maputra. It doesn't come up quite as often, but it definitely comes up sometimes. Basically, what this card does is if your non-effect monster battles, you can banish this from the graveyard, and then your opponent's monster loses 1500 attack. That's about all it does. It's non-targeting, so it's half decent, but it's definitely got its drawbacks. Next is Adhara. I actually think this is the best card in the archetype. It kind of, like, mixes everything together. It's level 1, so the leveling and the typing and the attribute, all of this is fantastic in this card. Basically, what this card does is if you control a non-effect monster, you can banish this card from the graveyard, and then you can target one of your banished Tenyi monsters that aren't this card, like this particular copy of the card, and then add it back to your hand. This card it recycles. Its typing and leveling are great. It allows you to go into the synchro monsters. It actually allows you to play Naturia Beast in this deck, which is one of the most devastating uh, synchro monsters ever made because it actually is an earth. So if you play something like an earth insect, like if you play the earth insect variant of the deck, you can easily just special summon this and then go into an Acharia Beast, which I love to do because a lot of decks right now, their main combo starters are actually spells. So definitely, this is a very good card. Like this, if you summon an Acharia Beast against Shadalls, like they're dead. There's nothing that they can do. No, they can. It doesn't matter how many Shadal fusions they activate. It doesn't matter how many Nadir servants they activate. Like this card, like Naturia Beast, just absolutely wrecks them. So really, really, really like Naturia Beast, and I really like this card. It lets you recycle. It's a tuner. You can summon it off of 1 for 1. Its level is low, so you can normal summon it if you have to. Like just all around, this is easily probably the best card in the archetype. On top of this, it's a free summon level 1 tuner. So it's one of the few cards that is actually splashed into other decks. The only cards in this entire archetype that's splashed into other decks are Veshuda, Adhara, and I've seen Berserker in certain decks, and I've actually seen. Well, he used to be played in Pendulums before they got Selene. But basically, these three are the only ones that are splashed into other decks. This card is amazing because it's a free summon for any deck as long as you have no monsters on board. And then without giving up your normal summon, now you have access to Needle Fiber basically. You normal summon whatever you want, and this plus any monster is a Needle Fiber, and we all know where Needle Fiber leads. But basically, yeah, this card is incredibly, incredibly good. Definitely the best card in the archetype. Next, we've got the Flawless Tenyi. I forget the full name. This card's like decent. Again, this is more of the protect the castle sort of version of the deck. Basically, what this card does is your non-effect monsters are unaffected by monster effects, which is pretty good because if your opponent tries to out something with like a Boar load or something like that, or an access code talker, your monsters are totally unaffected anyway. So that effect is fairly decent. On top of that, has another decent effect, which is that you basically can, if you control a non-effect monster or a set monster, which is kind of cool. Even if you have set monsters, it still works out. And your opponent special summons an effect monster, you get to draw 2 cards, which is that's actually a pretty decent effect too. It's like it's like it has 2 fairly decent effects, but the whole card just dies to 1 MST. Which is a bit frustrating. It's a reactive card, which I don't like. Your opponent has to do something. On top of that, it doesn't actually create any advantage until your opponent does something. And that's kind of my issue with the card. But it's a decent field spell, I gotta say. And if you're gonna do anything, you play this with the Link 4. It's actually fairly good. It gets you sort of your resources back. I probably put it into B tier. I probably rated it a little too low. It's a half decent card. This is the Heavenly Cycle. This card's fairly good. I'd say A tier. Basically, what this lets you do is tribute a worm on your side of the field, and if it's a non-effect monster that you tribute, you get additional effects. So basically, you tribute a worm, you get to add a worm to your hand, and if you tribute a non-effect worm, you get to special summon that worm to your side of the field, but that monster's effects are negated. That doesn't really matter because none of the Tenyis have any effects on the field anyway, like that you would special summon for the main deck, so it doesn't matter. And this card is actually fairly good in Phantasm Spirals, which is totally unaffiliated, but this deck and Phantasm Spirals do have certain levels of synergy actually together. But that's basically the first effect of this deck. Also, you can summon Mermare, which is very good. And Mermare, it doesn't matter if you negate the effects of Mermare because you just link it away for the Link 2, and then you can just bring it back anyway, so it doesn't even matter. On top of that, this has a second effect, which unfortunately has a restriction. Its second effect is you can banish this from the graveyard, and then you can add a Tenyi Spawn Trap card, or you can add a Tenyi card, which, again, that effect is good. The only issue is you can't use both effects in one turn. So you can only use one effect and only once that turn, and that is a bit frustrating. The positive thing is that this is a quick play spell card, which is fairly good because you can basically set it, activate it on your opponent's turn, and then the next turn you can search for that, counter trap or field spell or whatever you need to search. But it is a bit unfortunate that the card, you can't activate both effects in one turn. It would not have been broken to be able to use both cards in one turn. It would not have been. So I don't really know why they did. It's almost like an over restriction. It's kind of unfortunate. At most, you would have, like, the first effect is actually a -1 if you really think about it, because you give up your monster and then you give up this card. So the first effect is actually a -1. So if the second effect was a +1, it would have just been, the entire card would have just been a net neutral anyway. So I don't know why that second restriction had to be on there. Like, this deck would not be tier 1 if that restriction was on. I don't know why they put it on there. Dragon Cycle, I'd say this is definitely somewhere in the S tiers. This effect is very good. Basically, it lets you send a worm to the graveyard. Then if you control a non-effect monster, you can add a Tenyi monster to your hand in addition to that. So it basically lets you mill one, and then it lets you, it lets you mill one, and then it lets you add one. So 2 great effects in one. Usually you can send Mare, get in graveyard as fast as possible. It's very good for those reasons. And then, of course, adding one is just as great also. This card ends up being, in many cases, a +1 every single time. Next we've got, and it's not F tier. My mouse is just stuck. This is the Tenyi counter trap. It's actually a fairly good counter trap. Basically, what it does is, again, this is more of like the protect the castle sort of summon a non-effect monster, sit on a bunch of like spells traps that help it. Basically, what this card does is it allows you to, if you control a non-effect monster, you can, and your opponent activates a monster spell or trap card effect, you can negate that activation. It doesn't destroy the monster, but it negates the activation. So that's kind of the drawback there. But in addition to that, if this card is set and it's destroyed, you can special summon a non-effect monster from your extra deck. That non-effect monster can be any non-effect monster. So it can summon like a Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. It can summon, obviously, this giant Tenyi monster. But normally, actually, the best target is usually either this Tenyi monster or the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. Both effects, both are fairly good options, but usually don't have the space to include the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. But if you are playing this in like a Blue Eyes deck, it's actually fairly good. But it's like a way to cheat it out. And that's pretty much it. I included Mare down here because every single Tenyi deck that I've ever seen and every deck that I've ever played has always had a Mare in it. So it's basically like it's basically like a honorary member of the archetype, but at the same time, it's like, it's not a part of the archetype, so I'm not going to review it. If it was anywhere, it'd be S tier. It's obviously a very good card. But incredibly enough, there aren't any F tiers in this deck. This archetype is so recent that there really aren't any bad cards. At the same time, overall, the deck doesn't go plus enough to be like a tier 1, tier 2 deck. Unfortunately, it is a tier 3 deck because there are a lot of restrictions on a lot of these cards, and that basically keeps it from being an amazing meta deck. But all that said, you can very much easily top regional or locals with this deck. It's still a very good deck. But that is the end of the video. If you would like to suggest any decks going forward, let me know. And thank you for watching. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this type of content, check out the other videos on the channel, and please subscribe. It helps the channel a lot. Again, thank you so much. Have a terrific day.